The sleek black sedan glided through the shadows of skyscrapers. Inside, Victoria Hale, a titan of global finance, studied documents for a looming $1.2 billion acquisition. Her driver, Adrian Morales, sat behind the wheel with stoic focus. A faint hum of French phonetics drifted from his earpiece. Victoria looked up, a condescending smirk cutting across her face. "Practicing? For what, Adrian?" she asked mockingly. "You're my driver, not my diplomat. Focus on traffic, not verb tenses." Adrian didn't argue. He caught her gaze in the mirror and smiled. 1 hour later, in the international boardroom, no one was laughing. Adrian Morales was 44 years old, a man whose presence was defined by a quiet, unbreakable discipline. For the past 3 years, he had been the primary driver for the Hale Group's executive suite. To the employees who hurried past him in the lobby, he was a ghost. A man in a crisp, dark suit who opened doors and kept the engine running. He was invisible, a functional part of the corporate machinery. But to 11-year-old Elena, he was everything. Adrian was a single father raising a daughter in the wake of a tragedy that still felt fresh. His wife, Maria, had been taken by an aggressive cancer 6 years ago. Since then, Adrian's life had been a series of precise calculations aimed at one goal: providing a stable, loving world for Elena. Adrian's daily routine was a masterclass in efficiency. He was awake at 5, preparing a healthy breakfast and packing Elena's lunch with handwritten notes hidden inside. He dropped her at school with a kiss on the forehead and a promise to be there at exactly 5 o'clock. His job as a driver for Victoria Hale was perfect for this phase of his life. It was predictable. It was local. It offered a steady paycheck, and, most importantly, it didn't require him to cross time zones. But Adrian was not just a driver. He was a man with a secret history that lived in the podcasts and audiobooks he consumed through his single earpiece during the long hours of waiting. Before the silence of his current life, Adrian had been a high-level diplomatic interpreter. He had spent over a decade traversing the globe, whispering into the ears of prime ministers and defense secretaries. He spoke 9 languages with the fluency of a native and the nuance of a poet. He understood the cultural weight of a misplaced pronoun in Arabic and the subtle aggression of a specific German phrasing. He was a master of shadowing, the art of translating simultaneously while capturing the speaker's exact emotional state and intent. He had lived in the high-pressure vacuum of international relations, where a single mistranslation could start a war or collapse an economy. He was an expert in reading the room temperature, knowing when a negotiator's silence meant agreement and when it meant a total breakdown was imminent. He had navigated the labyrinthine corridors of power in Brussels and the high-tech hubs of Singapore, always 2 steps ahead of the tension. Everything changed on a cold Tuesday in Geneva. Adrian was in the middle of a high-stakes trade summit when he received the call that Maria's condition had turned critical. He was halfway across the world, trapped in a room where billionaires argued over percentages while his world was collapsing. He hadn't made it back in time to say goodbye. That guilt became the fuel for his transformation. He walked away from the embassies and the high-profile summits, choosing the steering wheel over the microphone. He chose the quiet streets of the suburbs because they led him back to Elena every night. He traded the adrenaline of the world stage for the simple joy of a bedtime story. Victoria Hale knew none of this. To her, success was a loud, visible thing measured in quarterly growth and aggressive expansion. She saw Adrian as a man of limited ambition, someone who had reached his ceiling and was comfortable there. She didn't understand the depth of a man who chose peace over prestige. On the morning of the deal, as the car navigated the morning rush, she continued to review the dossiers of the foreign representatives they were about to meet. She was nervous, though she would never admit it. This $1.2 billion deal was the culmination of 2 years of work. It involved a consortium from France, Germany, Spain, Russia, and the Middle East. It was a logistical nightmare and a linguistic minefield. She had hired the most expensive translation agency in the city, but she still felt like she was walking into a trap. Adrian adjusted the mirror, noticing the tension in her jaw. He wanted to tell her that the French representative was known for using complex legal idioms to hide unfavorable clauses, but he remained silent. He knew his role. He was the driver. He was the man who kept the engine running and the doors held open. He was a man who had traded the world's secrets for a school-run schedule, and he wasn't ready to let the world back in just yet. The boardroom on the 60th floor was a glass-walled arena where the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the static energy of distrust. The table was a massive slab of polished mahogany, surrounded by representatives from 5 different nations, each with their own agendas and hidden fears. Victoria sat at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning the faces of the men who held her company's future in their hands. The primary translator, a nervous young man named Marcus, stood to her left, sweating under the weight of the moment. Adrian had been asked to wait in the back of the room, a common request from Victoria when she needed him to be ready for an immediate departure. He stood near the heavy oak doors, his hands clasped in front of him, looking like a decorative element of the room. As the negotiations began, the cracks appeared almost immediately. The French delegation started speaking in rapid-fire bursts, using technical jargon that Marcus struggled to keep up with. Every time he paused to clarify a point, the German representative would huff in frustration, checking his watch with exaggerated annoyance. Then, the Spanish group began a side conversation, their voices rising as they debated a specific environmental clause. Victoria watched the room spiraling out of her control. She could feel the deal slipping through her fingers. The technical translation equipment began to fail, a high-pitched hum echoing through the headsets of the delegates. Marcus was paralyzed, his face turning a bright shade of crimson as he tried to juggle 3 languages at once. The atmosphere turned toxic as the nuances of the contract were lost in translation. The delegates weren't just misunderstanding the words, they were misunderstanding each other's cultural signals. To the German team, the Spanish team's passion looked like instability. To the French, the British team's directness felt like an insult. This wasn't just a business meeting, it was a psychological standoff where every participant was using their native tongue as a shield. The room was no longer a place of business. It was a Tower of Babel, where every attempt at communication only served to widen the gap. Victoria could see the predatory glints in the eyes of her competitors. They were circling, waiting for the moment the Hale Group showed total weakness, ready to pounce on the remains of her empire. The tension reached a breaking point when the Russian representative leaned back and whispered something in his native tongue to his associate. The tone was dismissive, almost mocking. At the same time, the representatives from the Middle East began to argue in Arabic, their gestures becoming more animated. Victoria looked at Marcus, pleading for a translation, but he just shook his head, his eyes wide with panic. I don't speak Russian or Arabic, Ms. Hale, I was only hired for the European bloc, he stammered. The room was now a cacophony of misunderstood intentions and rising tempers. The German representative stood up, his face flushed with anger. "This is a circus," he said in English, his accent thick. "If you cannot even provide basic communication, how can we trust you with $1 billion partnership?" Victoria felt a cold sweat prickling her skin. This was it. 2 years of her life, the future of the Hale Group, and her own reputation were being incinerated because of a communication breakdown. She looked around the table, seeing only closed faces and crossed arms. The French group was already whispering about leaving. The Spanish team was packing their tablets. The deal was dead on the table. She looked at the city skyline outside the window, wondering how she would explain this failure to the board. She was a woman who prided herself on being prepared for every contingency, yet she had failed at the most basic level. She had ignored the human element. She had assumed that money was the only language that mattered. She realized, with a sinking heart, that she was about to lose everything because she couldn't understand what was being said in her own boardroom. And then a shadow moved from the back of the room. Adrien, the man she had mocked for practicing his French just hours before, stepped forward. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He moved with a calm, gravitational authority that caused the room to slowly quiet down. He walked toward the head of the table, his eyes fixed on Victoria for a brief second before he turned to the delegates. He saw the chaos, he heard the hidden insults, and he felt the weight of the silence that was about to swallow the room. He knew he was about to break his own rule. He knew that by speaking, he was opening a door he had kept locked for years. But he saw the desperation in Victoria's eyes. The same look he had seen on foreign dignitaries before a crisis. He couldn't stand by and watch the world fall apart when he had the keys to hold it together. He took a breath, adjusted his tie, and prepared to remind everyone that the most powerful tool in the world isn't a contract, it's the truth. The room was a powder keg, and the Russian representative was about to light the fuse. He turned to his partner and said in low, sharp Russian, "They are incompetent. Let's wait for them to fail and buy the assets for pennies in 6 months." Adrien didn't hesitate. He stepped into the light of the conference table and spoke. But he didn't speak English. He spoke Russian. His voice was smooth, carrying a formal, high-registry dialect that signaled deep respect and even deeper power. "Actually, Minister Sokolov," Adrien said in Russian, "the assets are currently undervalued by 20% due to temporary market shifts. If you wait 6 months, the European Central Bank will have already locked the interest rates, and you will pay double. Ms. Hale is offering you the only window for a profitable entry." The Russian representative froze, his mouth slightly open. He looked at Adrien, really looked at him, and saw the posture of a man who had walked the halls of the Kremlin. Before the room could even react, Adrien turned to the German delegate. "Herr Schmidt," he said in perfect technical German, "the clause you are concerned about regarding the logistics hub is not an oversight. It is a protection mechanism against the very tariff changes you discussed in Frankfurt last month. If you look at page 42, you'll see the indemnity clause is actually in your favor." The German man sat back down, his eyes narrowing in shock. Victoria Hale felt the air leave her lungs. She watched her driver, the man who spent his days checking her tire pressure, navigate the room like a grand master on a chessboard. Adrien moved to the French delegation next. He didn't just translate, he interpreted. He used a specific Parisian idiom to explain Victoria's vision, a phrasing that conveyed a sense of shared history and mutual honor. He then pivoted to the Arabic-speaking group, his voice softening as he used the formal greetings and poetic structures of high-level diplomacy to de-escalate their concerns. He explained the partnership not as a transaction, but as a mithaq, a covenant between houses based on honor. Within 15 minutes, the shouting had stopped. Within 30, the delegates were laughing. Within an hour, they were reaching for their pens. Adrian stood beside Victoria, translating back and forth between 9 different languages without a single stutter, without a single moment of doubt. He corrected Marcus's previous errors with a polite nod and smoothed over the cultural slights that had nearly ended the deal. He was interpreting the unspoken language, the body language, the micro-expressions, the subtle shifts in tone. When the final signatures were placed on the document, the room erupted in a genuine round of applause. The Spanish representative stood up and shook Adrian's hand first, speaking in Spanish. "You are the most talented man in this building, my friend." Adrian simply smiled and replied in Spanish, "I am just a man who knows the value of being heard." As the delegates filed out of the room, still buzzing with the excitement of the deal, Victoria remained in her chair. She felt like she was in a dream. She looked at the $1.2 billion contract on the table, and then she looked at Adrian. He had returned to the back of the room, standing by the oak doors, his hands clasped, his face once again a mask of professional neutrality. He looked exactly like the driver she had mocked that morning. "Adrian," she said, her voice trembling slightly. What was that? Who are you? Why in God's name are you driving my car?" Adrian walked back to the table, but he didn't sit. "I am the same man I was this morning, Victoria," he said quietly. He told her the truth then. He told her about the years spent in the cold rooms of the UN, the nights in the Middle East, and the summits in Asia. He told her about the phone call from the hospital in Geneva, and the crushing weight of the 5 hours he was late to say goodbye to his wife. "When Maria died, I realized that I had spent my life translating the world's problems while ignoring the silence in my own home," he explained. "Elena lost her mother. I wasn't going to let her lose her father to an airplane seat and a diplomatic briefcase. I chose to drive because it meant I could be the one to hear her stories at dinner. It meant I could be present for the only language that matters to me now. My daughter's voice." Victoria listened, the silence of the room amplifying the weight of his words. She looked at her own reflection in the polished mahogany, a woman who had won everything but had no one to go home to. She had seen Adrian as a servant, a lower-tier employee with no vision. She realized now that he was the most successful person in the room. He had found the balance she didn't even know existed. He had the power to move billions, but he chose the power to move a child's heart. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I laughed at you. I told you that you were just a driver." Adrian shook his head gently. "You weren't wrong, Victoria. I am a driver. And today, I just drove us to a better destination." The aftermath of the deal was a whirlwind of press releases and celebratory phone calls, but for Victoria, the victory felt secondary to the revelation in the boardroom. The following morning, she asked Adrian to come up to her office, not as a driver, but as a guest. She sat him down in the plush leather chair across from her desk and laid out a document. "I've spent the night thinking," she began, her tone a mix of business-like focus and newfound humility. "The Hale Group needs you, not behind a wheel, but at the heart of our international operations. I'm offering you the position of Global Chief Strategist and Head of International Relations." She pushed the paper toward him. "The salary is 10 times what you make now. You'll have a private office, an expense account, and a seat on the executive board. You'll be the face of this company on the world stage. You saved a $1.2 billion deal in an hour. Imagine what you could do in a year." Adrian looked at the contract, his eyes scanning the numbers and the titles. It was the life he had once lived, only grander. It was the ultimate validation of his talent. He saw the travel stipends, the high-tier bonuses, and the prestige. It was a golden ticket back to the world of power, a world that respected his mind above all else. But Adrian didn't pick up the pen. Instead, he looked at Victoria and asked a single, piercing question that hung in the air like a bell. "Will I still be home by 5, Victoria?" The silence that followed was heavy. Victoria looked at the clock on her wall, then at the stacks of folders on her desk, and finally at her own calendar, which was booked solid until 10 o'clock every night for the next 3 weeks. She wanted to lie. She wanted to say yes. But she knew the world he was asking about. She knew that global strategists didn't have 5 o'clock dinners. They had midnight conference calls and 6 MA flights to London. She knew the cost of that kind of success, the hidden taxes paid in missed birthdays, cold dinners, and empty seats at school plays. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "No, you wouldn't. This role, it's a lifestyle, Adrian. It's a sacrifice. You know that better than anyone. You'd be on a plane more often than you'd be in your own kitchen." Adrian nodded, a soft, sad smile appearing on his face. "Then I cannot accept." He stood up, leaving the $1 million contract untouched. "I appreciate the respect you're showing me today, Victoria. Truly. But I made a promise to a 7-year-old girl 4 years ago that her daddy would always be the one to open the door when she got home. That promise isn't for sale, not for $1 billion, and certainly not for a title." Victoria sat back, stunned by the absolute clarity of his conviction. She realized that she had been trying to buy his genius without understanding his soul, but she was also a brilliant CEO, and she wasn't about to let him walk away entirely. "Wait," she said, her mind racing. "What if we change the rules? What if you became a remote advisor? You don't need to be in the office. You don't need to travel. You provide the cultural and linguistic intelligence from your home. You train our internal team. You're our ghost consultant. You work on your own terms. We can build a localized department around your expertise. You're home by 5, every single day. No exceptions." Adrian paused, his hand on the door handle. He looked back at her and saw something different in her eyes. It wasn't just the desire for a business asset. It was a genuine respect for his boundaries. She was willing to bend the corporate world to fit his life, rather than the other way around. "I could do that," Adrian agreed, his voice steady. "As long as the contract explicitly states that family comes first. If there's a crisis in Tokyo and a piano recital in the suburbs, I'm at the recital. My daughter is my only priority, Ms. Hale. Everything else is just noise." Victoria smiled, reaching for her pen to make the handwritten amendment right then and there. "Agreed. I think I have a lot to learn from you, Adrian, and not just about languages." The evening sun was casting a golden glow over the quiet suburban street when Adrian's truck pulled into his driveway. The engine turned off with a soft click, and the silence of the neighborhood took over. He stepped out, his suit jacket draped over his arm, feeling the cool air on his face. Before he could even reach the porch, the front door flew open and Elena came running out, her hair a messy tangle of curls, and her face lit up with pure joy. "Daddy, you're home!" she cheered, throwing her arms around his waist. Adrian scooped her up and spun her around, her laughter ringing out more clearly than any boardroom applause. "How was work, Daddy?" she asked as he set her down. Adrian thought about the 9 languages, the $1.2 billion, and the frozen look on Victoria Hale's face. He thought about the $1 million contract he had walked away from, and the new life that awaited him. He smiled and took her hand. "It was busy, Elena. Very busy, but I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." He didn't tell her about the money or the power. Instead, he spent the next 2 hours helping her with her Italian homework, patiently explaining the difference between the past and the present tense. Back in the city, Victoria Hale sat in her dark office, the only light coming from her computer screen. She looked at the empty car in the parking lot below, the sedan that Adrian used to drive. She thought about her laugh in the back seat just 24 hours ago, and how hollow it felt now. She remembered her own words. "You're my driver, not my diplomat." She realized that she had almost lost the deal of a lifetime, not because of a technical glitch or a bad market, but because she had failed to see the extraordinary human being sitting 5 feet in front of her. She had judged a man by his uniform, and in doing so, she had nearly blinded herself to the truth. She realized that she, the billionaire CEO, was the one who was truly poor in the things that mattered. She had chased numbers while Adrian had chased moments. The next morning, Victoria did something that sent shockwaves through the entire Hale group. She arrived at the office early, but she didn't walk through the private executive entrance. Instead, she waited at the main curb. When Adrian's car pulled up, the car he was still driving until his new consulting role fully transitioned, she didn't wait for him to step out. She walked over to the driver's side and opened the door herself. Adrian looked up, surprised. "Ms. Hale?" Victoria offered a warm, sincere smile. "From now on, Adrian, we're partners, and partners open their own doors." She wasn't doing it for the cameras or for the board. She was doing it because she had finally learned that true value isn't found in a title, a price tag, or a billion-dollar contract. It's found in the quiet integrity of a man who knows what he's worth and who he's living for. Adrian Morales was no longer just a driver. He was the man who reminded an entire corporation that the most important deals in life aren't signed in ink. They are kept in promises made to the people we love. As the sun rose over the city, the black sedan pulled away, but the dynamic had changed forever. The silence in the car was no longer the silence of two strangers in different worlds. It was the comfortable quiet of two people who understood that respect is the only language that truly translates everywhere. And for Adrian, as he watched the miles go by, he knew that the best part of the drive was always the moment he turned toward home. He was a man of 9 languages, but Daddy was the only title he ever needed. If you believe that true value isn't found in a title or a price tag, subscribe to High TL Stories. We tell stories where quiet dignity defeats loud arrogance, and where true devotion always finds its way.